Yeah, so we're going to have a brief overview of serviced accommodation. So what is serviced accommodation? Serviced accommodation, it's when we're operating a property, which can be a flat, can be a house, it can be a large house, and that is fully furnished short-term rental properties. So that means it's often people are calling these Airbnbs. Airbnb is, of course, one of the channels through which we can do short-term rentals. There are a lot of other ones as well, channels like booking.com. And we'll speak a little bit later as well that when we're operating serviced accommodation, these different channels are charging quite high commission rates. In the case, for example, of booking.com, it's generally 15%. Sometimes we're paying more if you want our listings to be at the top of the ranking. And in the case of Airbnb, the fees that the property owner or the property operator is paying are a lot smaller, like something like 3%. But in this case, the person booking is paying probably something like 15% fees on top of the price that we're charging. So serviced accommodation, it's combining hotel-like services with home comforts. So hotel-like services means that when we arrive in a hotel, we expect everything to be ready. We can go straight away to sleep. The bed's made up. We've got all the amenities. If you want to take a shower, there's everything that's needed for that, towels, etc. And serviced accommodation, we've got all these features, plus the fact that it's sort of more like a home. Generally, there's a kitchen so people can cook their food. So yeah, serviced accommodation is ideal for business travelers, tourists, contractors. We've got here relocating families. This is generally a really good one because when families are relocating, it could be, for example, people moving from the US to the UK for maybe 3-6 months for work. So they're not going to be buying or like renting long-term a property, but people need somewhere to stay for a few months. This is really good because it's less changeovers, and that is often a target market for serviced accommodation. Obviously, when we look at this, it's not like renting a house out to family that's going to be staying there long term and looking after everything. Well, hopefully looking after everything. In the case of serviced accommodation, it's a massive amount, in fact, of management if you're going to be doing it yourself. So if you've got a rental property, yes, you can get a lot more income from serviced accommodation. But yes, also it's a lot more, yeah, it's a lot more work, requires a lot more time. It means obviously dealing with guests, having the property set up properly, sorting out cleaners, maintenance, guest supplies, sorting out the listings on the website. So it's not a passive. It can be passive if you got a property, it's good for serviced accommodation, and you put in place or you use a managing agent. Managing agents obviously are charging a fee, typically is 15% plus VAT. That's probably the minimum. Sometimes it can be a bit more. And obviously, if there's a really good income, then it can still be profitable with a managing agent. But a lot of people like to get into serviced accommodation because they've got some time. They're going to be looking after the operations, maybe at least at the beginning themselves, and getting the maximum cash flow from the property. So yeah, why invest in serviced accommodation? I say invest because serviced accommodation can be a way of operating a property that we own or that we're going to buy as an investment property. It could be a standard terraced house that could work for a long-term family staying in there. But if we're like close to transport facilities, not that far from a town where there's either touristic demand or business demand, then we can potentially get considerably higher income on serviced accommodation. When I started myself buying these mid-terraced houses. I was buying them initially in South Wales, not that far from Cardiff, like something like 30 minutes, and generally quite a high demand for serviced accommodation, either touristic demand and a lot of contractor demand. And my aim at the time was to get maximum cash flow to be able to replace work income. So serviced accommodation, I had some time to at least at the beginning manage stuff initially myself, and then took on people to look after the ongoing management. But obviously a lot more intensive, but a much higher cash flow. Similar to, basically we've got 3 steps. The first step is standard long-term rentals to a family. Second step is HMO, so room by room basis, but still people are staying in there for several weeks. And then serviced accommodation, much more management intensive, but yeah, typically the highest cash flow. Yes, so why do serviced accommodation? Higher income potential than traditional rentals. Also, we know now that if you're putting long-term tenants in there, especially with the new renters' rights bill, it can take a really long time. If we want to sell the property, we can't just say to the tenants move out. There's a lot of conditions that need to be satisfied. So if we need that flexibility because we're thinking of selling a property, or maybe changing misuse, maybe we're thinking of making it into an HMO, then yeah, operating it for some time as serviced accommodation can be a really good choice. Then we've got potential tax benefits. Generally, if operating serviced accommodation, we're going to be subject to business rates rather than council tax. And if it's small business, in most cases, operators are going to have business rates exemption. So there's no tax, council tax, and there's in reality nothing to pay on business rates. And then we've got things like capital allowances where we can claim back some of the capital expenditure. There are going to be soon limitations on that basically remove most of those advantages. And also, whilst talking about serviced accommodation, we've been speaking up until now about doing serviced accommodation in properties that we own. We've got this possibility of what's called rent to service accommodation, R2SA. That's where we're renting a property from a landlord with the agreement that we can operate the property as serviced accommodation. So obviously the difference between the income that we're getting from the serviced accommodation minus obviously the costs including the rent that we're paying to the landlord, it is still possible to get quite good cash flow. And it can be a good way of someone who wants to start understanding about property, getting into property, potentially interested in serviced accommodation as well, to without having to buy a property. Obviously there's deposit, the rental to pay, and typically as well it's needed to pay for the furniture or to lease the furniture. But it's a lower cost way of getting into property and serviced accommodation, and people will use that serviced accommodation income to build up a pot, potentially then for buying the first property. But always remember that it is quite intensive in time and management. And doing rent to serviced accommodation, it's rarely profitable to do it with a managing agent because there's just too many things stacked up. There's the rent paid to the owner of the property, the landlord. Then there's the fees paid to the managing agent. And then what's left, if there's anything left, goes to the person that's got the the rent to serviced accommodation contract. So yeah, quite a lot of good reasons for doing serviced accommodation, but always bearing in mind quite intensive in time and in management. Compliance on serviced accommodation, we could go into this in a lot more detail, and yeah, people that want help on this, or we can do offer consulting or specific advice on everything that we're looking at, everything that's on this sheet. So yeah, question of understanding planning classes. It is possible to operate except in certain areas, a standard residential house or flat So that's C3 planning class as serviced accommodation. If we're in London, we can only do that for 90 days per year. And there are some restrictions in other areas of the country as well. And there's also new planning classes coming in, which are planning classes. They're already in place in some areas of Wales, and they're coming in, I think, soon in some areas of England. So these are specific planning classes for use of a property as a holiday let, or then there's also a planning class for use of a property as a second home. So we need to be aware of these planning classes, 90-day rules, and navigate appropriately around them. Standard buy-to-let mortgage doesn't normally allow use of a property as serviced accommodation. So it's needed to check carefully with the mortgage provider as to whether the property can be used as a serviced accommodation. Generally, the lenders refer to that as holiday let use. Holiday let mortgage and serviced accommodation mortgage is exactly the same thing. And there's also, this is more in the case of if we're doing serviced accommodation with flats, then it's needed to be sure whether the lease and management agreement, so the block management, allows short-term accommodation. So before starting or before purchasing a property with the aim of operating it as serviced accommodation, need to check all of these things. And then we've got licensing requirements, and then health, safety, insurance, compliance. Key thing is fire risk. Generally, on all serviced accommodation units or houses that are operating as serviced accommodation, then we're going to do a fire risk audit and make sure that everything is compliant. In the case of probably a small house or a small flat, we don't necessarily need more compliance than a standard long-term rental. Sometimes if, for example, the way out, the exit isn't that obvious, then we might need emergency lighting, maybe some signage, but there the fire risk audit will determine all that. And that's definitely always worth spending that money, even if it's not necessarily obligatory. When we talked about managing agents. There are larger companies like cottages.com and Sykes and similar ones that can also do the management. And interestingly, if you're going to be taking a contract with one of these larger holiday let companies, they will normally require fire risk audit, or at least a self made one. So yeah, and you need to have the appropriate insurance, public liability, and just check all of that. It's not just a question, I've got a house, I've got a contract, and I can start renting it out. Check all of these things. What makes a good serviced accommodation property? So locations that are near transport hubs, or at least like, for example, some of the things that we're doing in areas I mentioned, South Wales, where I started buying property 7 or 8 years ago. All of the properties are within walking distance of a train station that's got a regular service into Cardiff. So we know that, yeah, that obviously makes a big difference. Attractions or business hubs. So yeah, get a good idea of the demand before starting serviced accommodation. And there are also tools to, there are some specific tools that are possible to use to get an idea of the rates. And then it's quite simply spending time studying available listings on Airbnb, booking.com, looking at this over a period of time, looking like at advanced rates to understand, yeah, if the property is going to be good. Also, quite often, properties that are near a large hotel can be good, because if, like, for example, there's a Premier Inn or a travel lodge in the area, that typically means that there's a good demand for either business or touristic type travelers. And also, what we were doing, for example, if operating in, for example, in Cardiff, there's a lot of concerts, rugby matches, and things like that. And we were tracking the rates, for example, on Premier Inn and Travelodge, because obviously these hotels have got people spending time checking all events. And we were looking at, like, for example, for 3 or 4 months ahead, and we see some weekends where the room prices went up from, for example, £80 up to 250 or £300, and those were clearly weekends or days when there were large concerts or events. And that also, doing that, gave us an idea of what the overall income potentially can be. So whatever area you're looking at operating in, these are things to look at. Which property types are suitable? Flats, solo travelers or couples, sometimes large flats for larger groups. Yeah, and houses for groups of people. Very important with flats is to check whether there is permission on the lease and the block management agreements for short-term lets. And even if there is that permission, need to understand, is it going to have a negative effect to neighbours? Are there going to be problems? Have you got enough security or control in place to avoid things like parties and strange things happening in the properties? Yeah, so a lot of things to cover. And then, yeah, key features, properties must be, even if it's an old property, must have like modern amenities, clean, comfort with everything working. Know your market. So yeah, a bit of overview of identifying, first of all, who is the ideal guest. Is the focus on tourists? Is it focus on, for example, tourists or people visiting a city at the weekends, and then during the week, maybe people on business, maybe it's corporate, maybe it's contractors, and the type, and let's say the level of person, if it's someone who's coming working, for example, as in like insurance or banks, then it might need different amenities from the person that's working on a local building project, like the contractors. So understand the market. There's no point in overdoing the property, just to have it at the right level. Mention here tools like AirDNA. AirDNA is a um, software tool. There's it's a paid subscription, there's a monthly subscription for it, which enables you to get a good idea of rates, occupancy rates. And typically, if we're looking at a new area, or if maybe we're helping or doing some consulting for an investor who's looking at trying to understand if serviced accommodation is going to work in a specific area, then we'll subscribe for 1 month for this specific area. For example, if we're looking in, I don't know, let's say we're looking in Manchester to understand what sort of income we can get from serviced accommodation, we'll subscribe to AirDNA for Manchester for a month and get a good idea of the data. Yeah, looking at seasonal trends, local demand drivers, getting an understanding, look at, for example, the tourist or the city websites, get an understanding for how many events are on. And like I said, also looking at hotel prices, looking also at yeah, competitor listing performance. A key thing is having really good quality accommodation in order to get reviews, and people are booking a lot based on reviews, or if the review scores are low, the only way of getting the bookings is via the low price. So are we either on a race to the bottom or a race to the top? I would definitely recommend the race more to the top. In other words, keeping the good quality standards, getting the good reviews, and that means also progressively having good prices. If the services are really good, people will, obviously there's a limit to how high price we can go, but people will prefer to pay a good price. And yeah, otherwise, if the reviews are low, the only way of getting the bookings is on price. yeah, so try and avoid that. There's also the question of some people are saying, look, we must absolutely get our 90% occupancy by reducing the prices. And I would say, what's best? Do you want 90% occupancy at £100 per night? Or do you want to go for 75% occupancy at £150 per night? I think there the calculation is fairly obvious that at 150 and 75%, we're better off. And also we've got less property cleaning costs, utility costs. So don't necessarily go for the maximum occupancy. Get the right trade-off on that. Creating a great guest experience goes without saying. So yeah, nicely furnished, feature walls, nicely color coded and matched and everything. Use of smart tech will save a massive amount of time. No lost keys if it's keyless entry. Obviously, Wi-Fi is a must, but having that so people can log onto the Wi-Fi using a QR code. Guest automation means automatically sending out messages when people book, automatically using systems to collect ID, deposits when necessary, etc. Having the right welcome packs, the right amenities. Sometimes a few little extra touches. I'm going to say not stupid things, but like having toothbrushes, things like that, what people forget. When if someone comes, for example, to accommodation and they haven't got their toothbrush with them, they're thinking, "Gosh, I've got to go to the shop. It's annoying." And then they find in the bathroom that there's some toothbrushes obviously in the boxes packed that people that obviously haven't been used before that they can use. That will be, yeah, really good, and like having good coffee machines, things like that. And then yeah, professional photos so that the listings are good quality, because it's the photos on the listing, the description as well. Take time to do a good description, and obviously the reviews and guest reviews are going to be really important. Getting your property seen. Obviously, we can go to a lot more detail on that, and we will actually be having a full online course on serviced accommodation, or we can on a consulting basis help with that. We've got a lot of experience in doing this on different properties, both our own and in helping other people set this up. So yeah, obviously to have the properties listed on the different websites. There are channel managers as well that can automatically do all this. In practice, I'm going to say 90% of the online bookings are going to be coming from Airbnb and Booking.com. Here it says build a direct booking website to reduce fees. That also makes sense. And then the key thing is as well is contacting guests when they booking in, understanding, for example, if
And I
they're
don't
contractors
care.
that
The
are booked
tenants are a
for
jerk, and I don't like them
a
anymore.
few
It's all
days,
yours.
then
If Gramps not gonna return the endearment,
contact
not gonna
those
watch on
guests, understand if they're likely to, if they want to like extend or maybe even stay for a few weeks, and do everything to cultivate those direct bookings. There's a lot of different actions to get those direct bookings. And what generally is a good percentage is maybe you'll start with 100% of bookings via the online agencies, 90% Airbnb and Booking.com. And then over time, aim to get, for example, something like at least 40% of direct bookings, and also go for the long-term bookings, people coming to stay for 2 or 3 months, either the longer contractor stays or people relocating. There are specialist websites also that deal with that, and it's also possible, for example, you've got property near a hospital, contact all the medical agencies that are sending staff there, contact the hospital, do everything to get the direct booking, engaging photos, strong descriptions, and leverage reviews. That basically means have a good property, good guest experience, so that the reviews are going to correspond to that, and there'll be real spontaneous reviews from guests. Day-to-day management. obviously, I keep repeating myself, but there is a lot of work involved. Be ready for that, and be ready for the commitment to properly manage everything if you want it to be successful. And there are tools that are doing dynamic pricing, or you can do it yourself by looking at comparables. Automate messaging check-ins. Obviously, need to have reliable cleaning, laundry services. Normally, it's best to have hotel type laundry services and have good guest response. Good way for guests to contact people. Unfortunately, at all hours, if we need to give a good guest response. Numbers have key performance indicators. There's different ones that we use. ADR stands for average daily rate. Occupancy rate obviously is the percentage of nights that are occupied. So we're talking about occupancy, average daily rates, and RevPAR. We use it in serviced accommodation. It's a lot more used in hotels, and that means the revenue per available room. So if we've got like a hotel, we've got 50 rooms, and we're talking about a revenue of £80 per available room. That is what the average the revenue is from the rooms. Managing the costs, so fees, utilities, cleaning, management. When we talk about utilities, it's also a question of automation, having systems in place that will automatically set the, for example, the thermostats back to a normal level. For example, if having systems where the guests can boost the temperature, but after a couple of hours, it's automatically going to go back to like some standard temperature, like for example, 20 or 21. And as soon as guests leave, have system in place to turn off the heating and to turn it on before guests arrive. And then, yes, be aware of some tax incentives like capital allowances. These are virtually going to be disappearing soon, but there are things we mentioned also, business rates. Different risks. So yeah, problem with voids, and sometimes as well, we can end up with double booking if we're not managing things correctly, or if there's problems with the channel managers. So yeah, all these things too. These are like details to look at. Clear cancellation, deposit policies, proper insurance, and yes, how to avoid parties. One of the worst like nightmares for people doing serviced accommodation. Quite a lot of ways, not necessarily around this. Generally, we never allow single night stays. It's normally only 2 night stays, but and that will avoid people just booking on the Friday night or a night to have a party. But also pay extreme attention to local people that are booking property. I know some people actually don't allow bookings from people in their same postcode area to avoid these potential parties. And then clear information to guests: no parties allowed. Have in place, and there's noise monitoring tools, special tools that can be put in properties which will alert the owner, well, the manager, when something, maybe there is some party, and obviously have people available that can go on site and understand what's happening, and yeah, tell people to leave if there's things happening that shouldn't be happening. Question of, say, going in there, look, you're out within 5 minutes, otherwise we're calling the police. So standard things, but all this is part of the management of serviced accommodation. So key takeaways and what to do now. Well, what to do now, it's consider advantages and disadvantages of serviced accommodation, understand if it's the right thing for you to do. So yeah, serviced accommodation offers high returns if done correctly, but it's a lot of work unless using an agent. And if you're using an agent, obviously there's costs involved, and understand if that makes the bottom line practical, and or there's not enough profit in there. Guest experience and compliance, obviously key things. We don't want any safety issues with guests. Start like with one unit, do adequate research. And yeah, if the rent to serviced accommodation strategy is one that you want to try out or do, yeah, of course, that's possible. There are techniques to finding potential properties for doing rent to serviced accommodation. Use tools, training, and expert advice to start and to scale the serviced accommodation. So that's a fast overview. Yeah, we can talk for a day or 2 days and obviously give a lot more in-depth training, which we do from time to time. But are there any questions at this point of time?
Hi, Trevor.
Yeah, hi, Nick.
Yeah, a question I was looking at when you mentioned that we need to notify the lender. Um, uh, what do we get? We get just a different rate, or we can be kind of refused at all from the
It can be
lender.
both. It'd be a question that some of the more standard buy-to-let lenders will not allow serviced accommodation, or will not
Right.
allow, for example, use as HMO, in which case we just can't do it, or we need to change lender. Or
Sure,
some
sure, sure.
might do it, but they ask permission,
High rate.
and then others might do it, but effectively at a higher rate. Generally, from experience, well, almost all my properties I'm operating either as HMOs or serviced accommodation, and quite a few lenders will do either or. So it's the same. And it's probably rates maybe either the same as standard buy-to-let rates, maximum 1% interest higher. But it does restrict the number of lenders available. This was more an issue probably like 5 or 6 years ago. Now there's so many people doing holiday lets, because that's what we call them, that there's a big range of lenders doing it. In the same thing that 5 or 6 years ago, buying a property in a limited company, you were paying 1 or 2% more in interest.
Extra.
Now it's virtually the same. Limited companies will always be slightly more because it's slightly higher risk for the lender, but generally no more than 1% as opposed to personal. And no one now would, I'm going to say no one in their right mind would buy an investment property in personal name, because it's not possible to deduct the interest payments as an expense. So often the cash flow, people that have bought property in personal names sometimes can end up with like negative cash flow. So they're actually paying to have someone staying in their property because they're paying tax on the complete income and cannot deduct the mortgage interest payments.
Sure.
And in fact, sometimes in that case, when people have got properties that are in their personal name, that they maybe be using as buy-to-let, one of the only ways of managing to get them into positive cash flow is to operate them as serviced accommodation, obviously assuming that they're in areas where serviced accommodation works. And but obviously still be aware of the quite intensive in management, or to have a good managing agent that's looking after it. Any other questions?
Another raise, I could kind of say, like, so we look in a prospect of low change on regard to the service accommodation. So we need to kind of, it's better off looking forward what the change is going to be before we can adjust any property on service accommodation.
Yes, I mean there's two things. One is if we're doing properties in London or London Borough, then there is this 90-day rule, and that is
Sure.
not going to change. And the only
Right.
way around that is to, which generally is impossible, is to get change of use from C3 planning class to C1 planning class on operators, because C1 is like hotels and guest houses. So to be, and then the other thing that is likely to be taking place is probably additional specific licensing for operating a property or serviced accommodation and new planning classes. But as long as there's historic use, we call that in general like grandfather rights. So someone's got a property in, I don't know, let's say in Brighton, classed as C3 residential, operating as serviced accommodation, so holiday lets. If next year there's a new planning class coming in saying C5 is holiday let, and you can only do holiday lets if you've got the C5 planning class, the properties that are already operating as holiday lets, and obviously proof of that, proof through like booking invoices and things like that, then those properties will automatically be in the new planning class. It's not planning application. However, if someone then is buying a property or taking a property that is operating as residential and want to change to serviced accommodation, then it will need to go through planning. Exactly the same as today, if you buy a 6-bedroom house that's C3, so residential, and you decide you want to operate it as an HMO, then you have to go to planning C3 to C4. If we're in England, then we can generally do it when we're not in like conservation zones or Article 4, then we can do that under permitted development. Otherwise, it's full planning, and it'll be the same thing when more areas implement the C5 and C6 planning classes. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll close on that. Yeah, hope that was useful for yeah, everyone who was there and also on the YouTube streaming. And yeah, contact us if anyone wants assistance or yeah, more training in the areas of serviced accommodation. Yeah, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Trevor. Appreciate it.
Yeah, cheers, bye.
Cheers.